thank you. Actually, this is a surprise element for me because I just got to know that I have to chair the session. But as an academic, I teach finance and strategy. So whenever my colleague has some exigency, they call me and say, why don't you just fill the gap? And then I enter the class, I realize that it is a class on human resource management. But sometimes before the students, you'll have to sound and appear a little intelligent. So I still manage the class. So now I realize the topic is resilience and reorientation, tomorrow's economy. So let me confess that I'm not an economist. So I will, however, try to be a little intelligent or appear to be intelligent. I know I'm sitting next to an expert in this subject. So having said that, thank God the budget just happened last week. So it makes the session a little easier, relatively easy. So let's open the session with your views on the union budget that was presented by the finance minister as an opening remark. And then I'll get some time to think on my next question.
It's it's a nice kind of trick question because, if you ask people who prepare the budget, it's always presented as the answer to hundreds of problems. And every paragraph in a budget speech refers to some problem or the other. But, having looked at a lot of budgets in the past, I've come to the conclusion that a lot of this is routine. And there's nothing wrong with it because if you became finance minister and you didn't have a paragraph on women or youth or sports or health or education, somebody would complain. So as a result, you cover everything. But as an economist, if you sit back, I think it's possible to say, well, look, these are the important things. In one sense, everything is important, but what's the big picture?
Yep.
So what did I take from the budget as the big picture? Well, it's clearly a budget which is presented at a stage when the economy has kind of come out of the deep decline into which it had fallen. During the year that's just over, you had a good growth, or just about to be over, maybe something like 7% or so. But most of that was really in the first half of the year. So the growth rate in the second half is actually less than 5%. Mm-hmm. The challenge really is looking ahead. I think she set a target of 6.5%. Yeah. It's good that the target is for acceleration. It's ambitious because the rest of the world is going to be in bad shape. The global economy will slow down compared to the previous year. And most of the international organizations are predicting growth in India something like 6.1 or something.
The fastest
so actually,
growing. The fastest.
Yeah, we will certainly be the fastest growing. But remember, an important reason for that is that the whole world is down. And the earlier rapidly growing country was China, which is going through a declining phase.
Yep.
So I don't think we should take too much satisfaction from being the fastest growing. Even if we grow at 5.5%, we'll still be the fastest growing. The real question is, what is it that we need? And my feeling is that if you're concerned about employment, giving the kind of jobs that people now increasingly feel that their education entitles them to, I think we have to aim at a growth ideally of about 7 or 8%, but maybe in the first normal year after the pandemic, 6.5 if we achieve, that would not be bad at all. Okay. Now the question is the budget tailored to do that? See, I think the most important thing about the budget is that the fiscal deficit she's going to reduce. Many people might think that, look, if you want rapid growth, and the world isn't going to be growing very rapidly, then maybe you want to continue the stimulus. I think that's wrong. Mm-hmm. So I think the decision to get the fiscal deficit back on a consolidation path is a right decision. for the current year. Actually, India's fiscal deficit is actually very high compared to that of most other countries. And you know what that means is that if you run a very high fiscal deficit, then over time the debt to GDP ratio rises.
Yep.
But more importantly, within the year, you're not leaving enough resources for the private sector because there's only that much borrowing capacity that the system has. And if the government takes it all, then there's not much for anyone else. So I think the reduction was important, but she has also said that she's going to reduce the fiscal deficit
4.5.
for the next 2 years to below 4.5. Let's say 4.5.
Yeah.
Now, you know, from 5.9 to 4.5 is a decline of 1.4% of GDP.
That's right.
Which is an improvement of 0.7% every year
Yep.
for the next 2 years. This is actually going to be quite difficult.
Is it going to be that linear as you say? Is it going to be that linear as you say from 5.9 to 4.5, 0.7? Is it going to be that linear or is that going to be...
No, it doesn't have to be linear. She hasn't said it will be 0.7 each year.
Yeah.
But remember, if you do 0.6 in the next year, then you'll have to do 0.8 in the year after.
There won't be supportive influencing factors that can soften...
Well, I think that's a very good question. See, the most important factor, of course, would be if growth is high. Because whatever you're going to do, if the economy booms, then the fiscal deficit will look as if it's reduced.
Yeah.
So, are there any factors that will cause the economy to boom? One of the most important is a revival of private investment.
That's right. I was about to ask
That,
that.
unfortunately, has not yet happened. Okay, it could be that you need to start the process of reduction, and if the financial system works well, capital markets work well, pro-investor sentiment is there, then yes, maybe private investment can expand and be funded. If, on the other hand, the sentiment is negative, then that's difficult to achieve. Now, you know, in a particular year, if the private investment isn't there and you expand public investment, providing it's in areas like infrastructure, where we have a big backlog, it's a good thing. I mean, when the private sector is ready to invest, they'll come in. But if you simply expand expenditure, subsidies, that kind of stuff, that's not a good thing. So I think from that point of view, I approve of the reduction in the fiscal deficit. I also approve of the fact that the way the budget is structured at the moment, they're hoping that much of the increase in expenditure will be capital expenditure.
Yeah.
Now, you know, this is subject to implementation. Because you can announce you're going to have a big increase in capital expenditure. But like if you're trying to invest in railways and for some reason land acquisition holds up the ability to expand the railway line, the expenditure won't take place. So there are uncertainties that we have to be watchful about. But I think if they anticipate enough early, identify the specific project, take a problem-solving approach to making sure that the major projects go ahead, it should be fine. A large part of it also is a grant to states for capital investment.
Yeah.
Now that depends very much on whether the states are in a position to meet their share of the expenditure and have the capacity to raise investment. Those are the uncertainties. Let me say there are always uncertainties in a budget. I don't think there's no budget that doesn't have uncertainties, but it's good to be aware of them, okay? So I think this year, she has a big advantage because we've got rid of the free food scheme, which was really meant for dealing with the exceptional stress of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Also, fertilizer prices are low, so subsidies will be low. So it's a big saving.
Yeah.
And the increase in capital investment is more, and the reduction in the fiscal deficit is largely a reflection of this saving. But you know, to do another 0.7 next year, and then another 0.7 the year after in the fiscal deficit, that is going to be very tough.
Okay,
and it's going to be tough for two reasons. One is, see, one approach would be that you just do it by expanding revenue.
Yeah.
But in our system, there's a huge need also to expand expenditure.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody talks about health and education. For years, we've known that our performance in that area is much less than it should be. Things are improving, but it's not at the rate that we wanted. Now, all those things are going to increase expenditure,
Okay.
then the tax increase has to be either higher than that or some other expenditure should be cut. And the one thing on which it is politically very difficult to take a stand is to identify expenditure that can be cut. Because the moment you do that, there's always some vested interest behind that particular expense. Already you see in the newspapers, somebody saying, well, the provision for this scheme has been kept very low, etc. You can't have fiscal adjustment if you believe that every bit of expenditure is ideal, essential, and can't be cut.
Yep.
And the government and public opinion will have to be mobilized, behind that. Now, one more point I want to mention here by way of background. Looking ahead, one of the biggest challenges we face is going to be climate change. It's staring us in the face.
Yeah.
We know what needs to be done. It's going to take money. I don't think the money is going to fall from some international tree, although certainly there can be significant international support. That's something perhaps in the G20 context the government will try to negotiate. But most of the money will have to come from domestic resources. So if you're going to manage the climate change well, and that's very important because if we don't manage it well, we'll have problems on water, we'll have problems on... look, the rise in temperature, the fall in agricultural productivity, all of those things will create major difficulties. And that means more spending. So how do you bring about a reduction in the fiscal deficit while accommodating all these demands for expenditure?
Since you mentioned health and education, and since we are in ThinkEdu, roughly, I'm just a trespasser into the subject of economics. So, tax GDP ratio is somewhere around 18 to 20%, not more than that. And
less than that.
So, 18%, give or take. So, given the priorities of the government, and especially, as you mentioned, railways, roadways, waterways, utilities. So there are some public infrastructure that needs to be created. And there is always this call for 6% of GDP to education. Now if education wants 6% and we need defense and all of that, so is it actually, and education and health, by the way, education is concurrent and health state subject. Is it really a reasonable ask? Is it not a tall order to expect 6% of GDP? If so, how do we then incentivize private investment in education, given that private institutions are also delivering public good?
Well, let me say that, when you say private investment in education, I don't think that by itself solves the problem because they may be bringing in investment, but they will expect the students to pay for it. They're not doing this purely as a philanthropic activity.
Yep.
Some of it can be, but most of it is, at least it's meant to cover costs and make some kind of a profit.
But student education loans are priority sector lending.
But so this is the point that, are people happy with an education expansion which involves a big increase in expenditure by the individual, or are they asking for a highly subsidized form of education? There's a good case for an education subsidy, but it has fiscal implications. And I don't have a good answer. By the way, I should emphasize that I'm a complete newcomer in the area of education. You described yourself as a newcomer in economics. The essential thing about education, quite frankly, is that I don't think we really know how money spent on education will deliver the goods. Yes, everybody is in favor of private universities on the grounds that if people are willing to come, why stop them? And if some people are willing to pay those fees, why not let them? But that's not going to solve the massive need for education. Massive need for education will either require government education at very low fees or scholarships that will enable students to get seats in private universities. That involves expenditure too.
Yeah.
Now
to the specific word in the topic, resilience. And you rightly pointed out that this budget is after the pandemic, and also the Ukraine war is more or less behind the budget. But at the same time, we should also understand that certain happenings that creates turbulence at a global level will definitely happen. I'm not saying there's going to be another round of pandemic, but the way in which we are integrating supply chains, the way in which we're getting globalized, definitely there will be another form of turbulence that will affect global economy. So, from that perspective, building resilience is definitely a necessity. Now, as an economist, what will be the metrics on which you would build resilience? I mean, are there any standard frameworks that countries can adopt to build resilience in terms of their economic architecture?
Well, resilience, means a number of things. One is it means financial stability. That is, you cannot be assuming that the world is one in which foreign money will be freely available at low interest rates.
Yeah.
So therefore, the financing of your development has to be done quite dominantly on the domestic financial strength with some support from outside. Support from outside. The current account deficit at the moment is likely to be 3% of GDP, and most people feel that's a little too risky, and ideally it should be around 2%. So 2% of GDP can come from outside. But if you want the investment rate to go up from the present level by 4 or 5 percentage points at least, there isn't that much scope for increasing the current account deficit. So that has to come from domestic savings, private and public. So more productivity, more surpluses, etc., etc. That's on financial resilience. The other thing is resilience to external shocks.
Yeah.
I think what you mentioned, by the way, that the Ukraine war is behind us. It isn't behind us.
No, at least
It's just sort of, it seems to be at a point where the conflict continues, but it's stabilized a bit. It could flare up any time, and we don't know what that would do.
I didn't want a war to happen again, so I just said,
nobody wants the war to happen again, but the problem is as long as that issue is not resolved, many of the consequences in terms of high oil prices, etc., we'll have to keep dealing with. There's resilience to climate change. That is, we know that temperatures are going to rise. We know that the monsoon pattern will change. We know that there'll be many more greater frequency, both of droughts and excess precipitation. How do we manage our water resources in such a situation? Other countries are going through this. In California, for example, they had a drought that's going on for 12 years or some such thing. Fortunately, we haven't had that so far. But given our situation, if you had 2 or 3 droughts in a row, the impact on agriculture would be enormous. And that would in fact lead to relief expenditure. So question arises, isn't it better to, so to speak, drought-proof the economy and thus avoid relief expenditure? Drought-proofing the economy means doing a lot more for water conservation, making sure that the water doesn't just drain off, and the mechanisms for that are well known. But it requires expenditure, mostly at the state level, but it does require expenditure. And that has to be added into the budgeting for the medium term. I would further say that one of the critical things, if you want to insulate yourself from climate change, is doing a lot more agricultural research to develop the kind of agricultural varieties that were a little insensitive to the rise in temperatures and so on.
Okay.
Now it's well established by many people. We are not doing very well on agricultural research. We're not funding it adequately, and the way it's funded isn't necessarily geared to the best productivity. And we also seem to have some doubts about whether we are welcoming scientific breakthroughs in agriculture, because a lot of it involves genetic modification. So what is the public's view on, should we try to increase the resilience of Indian agriculture by having more genetically modified crops, or we should only stick to organic farming. There's quite a large civil society group which would say that we should do organic farming. But organic farming will not be able to deal with a 2-degree rise in temperature over the next 25 years in some parts of the country.
But
So how do
don't we
handle
have the maximum number of rice varieties compared to other nations? Isn't that a proof of our capacity to be indigenous and doing?
Yeah, we may have varieties, but it's not clear that those varieties are geared to deal with the sort of temperature pressures that will arise as a result of climate change.
Okay.
You can always have a multiplicity of varieties, but if those varieties don't address the specific stress points that you're worrying about, it doesn't help that much.
What's your view on the digitization of the public utilities? Has that built enough resilience in the system?
Well,
because that was one of the biggest advantages that the government could fall back on, especially during COVID, when they disbursed grants and all other, the digitization of public services.
I have no doubt that the push towards digitalization, and this is something that's happened over several years. In a way, the mobile expansion which took place actually during the UPA government, but which continued and further expanded during the present government. Yep. The Aadhaar platform,
yep,
which again was developed during the UPA government, but has now been expanded further, and the financial inclusion, which has led to many people having access to bank accounts, along with public utilities like UPI, India Stack, etc. I think this has created a situation where a very substantial part of the population is in a position to benefit from digitalization. Mm-hmm. Now, mind you, we have quite a bit to go because, although there's a lot of smartphone penetration in many parts of the country, the downloading speeds, etc., are not good enough to really think of a very substantial move, but that's just a matter of time. But I agree that digitalization is one of the structural changes taking place, which can lead to an increase in productivity.
Yep.
It can create a stimulus for innovation in which young people can get involved without having to have billions of dollars to spend. And I think that's a positive for India. Mind you, that digitalization trend is not unique to India. It's happening everywhere.
But the world is appreciating the Indian model for the scale at which it's happening.
Well, by definition, other than China, we're the only country that can deliver scale.
Yeah.
So it's like saying that if you're asking yourself what percent of the population in Malaysia have smartphones and what percent in Indonesia have smartphones, they may actually be higher than India. But the difference in India is the scale involved.
Yeah.
Both in absolute numbers and geographic. Yeah. So that is an important factor. I would say that, the possibilities that continued expansion of digitalization holds out for the future is a definite positive which could contribute to us achieving higher rates of growth if we manage it well. The other aspect which we need to think about is how are we going to deal with the world in which trade trends are getting a little uncertain.
Uh-huh.
There is a view that the world is turning away from globalization, which is true. Some big countries, for example, are resorting to protectionism, and this raises
So is WTO and all of that getting irrelevant?
Well, not irrelevant, but they're not. The developed countries, they don't say that they're not going to pursue trade, but they don't seem to be wanting to do it in that multilateral set of rules context.
Okay.
And many of them is resorting to protectionism.
Or is there a shift in the bargaining power? You see any shift in the bargaining power?
Well, I think what has really happened is that the rise of China has shaken up the leading countries, the United States. See, for a long time, the rise of China was a globalization of the world without questioning the US's hegemonic position and everybody felt that's good. And in those days, people expected the Chinese to essentially join the rest of the world. And many American scholars said that, if they open up to trade and all the rest of it, then they will become more democratic. Now, that's clearly not true. Chinese never said that, by the way. The Chinese were always viewing trade as something that they can take advantage of, but they wanted to retain the primacy of the Chinese Communist Party in China. They always said that. What has happened is that in the last 2 or 3 years, this has become much more explicit in the sense that the Chinese official party line is that, look, we are not just expanding, we want to challenge the United States leadership, both commercially and technologically and militarily. Now, that's a very big challenge, and clearly, as the incumbent power, the US is not happy with that, and they've taken a whole lot of steps which kind of trying to insulate or isolate China, as a result of which there's a potential fracturing of the global trade alliances. It raises the question, what should India be doing?
Yeah. So that actually invites me to the second part of reorientation, because my 101 course in economics just says agriculture, manufacturing, services. This shift from China, is it opening up opportunities, which I see considering the PLIs and various initiatives, as India becoming a manufacturing hub for the world?
Well, I think it is.
So that reorientation is possible in manufacturing.
Well, let me make 2 points. One is, we are very fixated on manufacturing, and I can understand that. All governments for the last 15 years have been talking about manufacturing, must go up to 25% of GDP, etc. Present government is doing exactly the same thing. I think on manufacturing, our growth performance has not been as great as we had thought when the reforms were implemented. Although overall growth has done very well, it's not been a growth led by manufacturing.
Yeah.
A lot has happened in services. Now, I think it's very important to realize that we shouldn't be nixing services.
Not at the cost
the
of
image that services is just some low
No value
productivity
add.
thing is wrong, I think. Increasingly, and in fact, digitization, what is happening is a lot of the growth is in services.
Yeah.
And also by the splitting of activity. Take, for example, computer chips. Now, the manufacture of a wafer is manufacturing, but the design of the chip is services.
Yeah.
It's being done separately. 25,000 guys employed in Bangalore and other places are designing chips.
Yep.
And that product is a service provided to the fellow who is then going to manufacture the chip.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with having that part of the value chain. Is not something to be sneered at.
No, not at the cost of services.
So a lot for us, the growth, the potential, and this is a consequence of both global integration and digitization, and also a sort of suspicion of China. For whatever reason, there isn't a suspicion of India, so we benefit from that. But I think even in manufacturing, I think there's increasingly a realization that, trade consists of global value chains. And there are global value chains in manufacturing. So if we want to be part of that system, then we need to be competitive in joining in the global value chain. That does not mean that you start by producing everything at home and then use it as an input into something at home and then so on. You will be importing things and exporting things. And I think the trade policy that we need for that should make it plain that we want to remain open. Now, I find in the discussions very often, nobody actually says that we shouldn't, but there are many, many times you hear recommendations that we should raise import duties in order to protect our domestic industry, etc. This can become dangerous because that's what happened in the 1970s. And that argument that let's raise import duties to protect domestic industries is what led inexorably to a high-cost, uncompetitive economy.
Yeah. But if
so
you
we've got to avoid that in the present circumstances.
Yeah, but if you contrast those times with the contemporaneous times, we have also moved up the value chain in terms of our capacity building and expertise in manufacturing. So no longer is this protectionism through high imports is actually one thing that the industry is looking for. They have developed indigenous capacity. So there is, as you said, a lot of potential for services and manufacturing to integrate cohesively. That is possible, isn't it?
Well, I certainly think it's possible. I hope that that's the message that industry is giving to the government. I'm not always sure that that is the message. Some industries seems to feel that the time has come to increase protective duties. Some industry. Now, whether the government listens to them or not is an open question. But this is an issue that should be carefully debated. I can fully understand in certain areas at certain times, you decide that, look, we're going to give a little bit of a special protection here for a limited period of time. But the overall framework has to be one in which India remains open. The present position is that, India's level of protection is much higher than that of other East Asian countries. So what I mean is, if these fellows, we are after all growing, we hope to become more important, we want to step into the space vacated by China. Is that possible if we continue with an average level of duties, which is almost twice that of other countries in East Asia? And my view would be that we ought to have a global target that, no, we're going to bring our duty levels down to the levels in these other countries. If you have a free trade agreement, you should have a free trade agreement in which your duty levels are not significantly higher than the duty levels of other people in the free trade agreement. Because then the benefits you give to each other are roughly equal. If you have a very high external tariff and you give duty-free access to somebody whose external tariff is much lower, he's getting a much bigger advantage than you are getting. But the solution to that is lower your own tariff. And I think this is an issue on which I hope that at some point the government will clarify what is their approach.
Okay.
Because I think they're getting mixed signals from industry.
Yeah, but some of the positive signals, indigenous 5G, the Vande Bharat, which is indigenous, these are some hopes, bright spots that we see. And it's time up, and that's what the monitor says. But anyway, we'll take two quick questions from the audience.
Good evening, sir. So my question is, we've recently seen Sri Lanka's economy collapse, and unfortunately they haven't recovered yet. It's devastating. The people are suffering terribly. And now we're seeing Pakistan head in the same direction. So my question is, according to you, what are some of the pitfalls that could have been avoided?
You mean what should they have done?
Your advice to Sri Lanka. Your advice to Sri Lanka.
No, I think, I'm now at a stage where I reflect on things. I don't give advice, least of all to neighboring countries. But, frankly, I think it's Pakistan and Sri Lanka are very different. And Pakistan has a lot of traditional, historical, accumulated problems. And, of course, right now, they've been hit by a pure and adverse natural event of huge consequences. I think in Sri Lanka's case, it's very clear that they ran themselves into very high fiscal deficits, pure fiscal irresponsibility, withdrew the use of fertilizers in the belief that they were going in for organic farming, not realizing that it would lead to a collapse in productivity, and excessive exposure to debt, external debt, mainly Chinese. Their big problem, quite frankly, is that they have a lot of debt owed to the Western powers, and they have a huge amount of debt owed to the Chinese. And frankly, they have been allowed to run up a debt which I don't think the country can sustain. So some kind of a haircut is necessary. What the Western countries are saying is that, look, we are not going to do the haircut unless the Chinese do a comparable haircut. And the Chinese are saying, no, we don't do this kind of thing. We have our own ways of handling the problem. And until this is resolved, Sri Lanka will not get any assistance from the IMF. I don't know how they can resolve it, because, when the problem becomes one of the creditors having to take a haircut, anything that prevents an agreement amongst the creditors is going to make it difficult to come to stability. So what will happen is they'll keep getting little amounts of aid to keep the thing going, but only at a level at which they'll never be able to import as much as they need and give the economy the freedom that it needs to recover. So it's not an easy situation.
Quick, short question.
I have one question, two parts. One is, you have been a deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. You have seen the growth of 9%, 8.5%, 9%, and now you're saying it's 5.5 to 6.1, and the current budget talks about 10.5%. Why this huge gap towards the growth? Second thing is,
What was the question on this 6 point?
the question is, you said the target should be 6.5 to 5.5.
No, that he
6.1.
answered while he said
No, he
also.
said, why
there is a global recession, and India's growth of 6.1
Will the
explains it.
budget 2 weeks before said they're targeting 10.5% growth?
10.5.
Yeah, that's all.
I don't know which budget.
You know, I tell you what, let me come clean on that. First of all, ever since we gave up planning, we don't have medium-term growth targets. What happens is you have a budget, and the budget gives a nominal growth target. Sometimes they mention the implicit real growth. Separately, there are targets of when will India become a 5 trillion economy, 10 trillion economy, etc. Those targets can be converted into a growth rate. I personally do not think that these size of the economy targets for 8 years down the road are terribly interesting. It's much better to say, well, look, we are going to grow at this percent, because then every year you can check, are you growing at that rate? These ambitious targets almost invariably involve growth rates of 8 and 8+%. Now, we did have growth rates of 8.5% in the year from 2004 for another 6 or 7 years. We haven't had that since. So the question is, what is a feasible target for India? Now, my own guess is that, I think for us to aim at 7.5% is ambitious but feasible. We may not achieve 7.5, but you must always aim a little bit more than you're actually going to achieve. So 7. Anything like talking about 8 and 8.5 for the next 5 or 6 years is just not feasible, in my view. I mean, people may have different views. Now the question is, what is needed to get there? Now, I think what is needed to get there is, one, we must achieve the fiscal consolidation which the finance minister has now laid down. That means less than 4.5% 2 years from now, okay? So we need to ask what is needed to get there. That's a whole range of questions. But in addition to that, it's not just stability. We will have to undertake many of the reforms needed in order to increase the productivity of the economy, what the economists call total factor productivity growth. Most of this is known, what needs to be done. It's all quite tough. One of the things is, for example, having a trade policy that allows India to remain open and to integrate with global value chains. Point number one. I would say that you need a much, much more efficient financial system than we have. And there's a huge agenda of how to get there, which actually includes removing government controls from the public sector banks. Very controversial politically. No party so far is willing to do that. Will we do it? I don't know. But we need to make a list of the 7 or 8 things. In some things there is agreement. Digitalization, government says a good thing. It is a good thing. Government's trying to do it. Probably we will not have too many obstacles in pursuing that. But even there, in a global world, as we integrate with the rest of the world, there's something in the newspapers today that the Europeans want certain kind of agreements which RBI and SEBI are not willing to accept, and unless we accept that, the European banks will have to shut down in India. Now, who's right and who's not right is very difficult to tell, because everybody, while they're negotiating, tries to get the best deal they can. But in the end, we have to find a solution. And we must look as if we're joining the world, not stepping out. And this kind of choice will come up over and over again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. I must recall, for the benefit of the audience, we had invited Mr. Ahluwalia in the early 90s to visit our institution, and that time when you were in the finance ministry, you deputed Mr. M.R. Sivaraman instead, and later recalled our invitation in the late 2000, 2010 as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. He came and delivered a wonderful lecture at Shastra. So I still recall that, fresh memories. Thank you very much, sir. A big round of applause.